There were about 30 men in that basement room, and every single one of them laughed at me. Not a polite chuckle. Not a quiet snicker behind a hand. I mean full, open, pointing at the old man laughter. The kind you get when someone does something so far outside of normal that the crowd just can't help itself. I was standing in the back of a county auction room in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, holding up my hand with 5 $1 bills pinched between my fingers. I'd just bid $5 on a condemned property that the auctioneer himself had described as a strong candidate for a controlled burn. The man next to me actually said it out loud. Old man just bought himself a coffin. My name is Arnold Dawson. I was 67 years old that day. I had $43 to my name, a duffel bag by my feet, and a toolbox I'd owned for 35 years. I had nowhere to sleep that night, and I was the most serious buyer in that room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you how a man ends up in a situation like that, because it didn't happen overnight. I was a carpenter. Not the weekend hobbyist kind. I mean a working carpenter, 35 years of it. Framing, finish work, custom cabinetry, full residential builds from foundation to roof. I started at 19 swinging a hammer for a framing crew in Lancaster County. And by the time I was in my late 30s, I was running my own small contracting operation. Nothing fancy. Just me and 2 or 3 guys doing solid work for people who wanted things built right. I built my own house that way. A 3-bedroom on a half-acre outside Harrisburg. Every board measured, cut, and fitted by hand. The oak floors, the built-in shelving in the living room, the front porch with the wide steps Helen always said made the place look welcoming. Helen was my wife. We had 40 years together in that house, raised our son Gary there, watched him grow up and leave and become somebody entirely different from who we thought we were raising. Helen died 2 years before all this. Pancreatic cancer. She was 63. It moved fast, like that disease usually does, and then she was gone, and I was alone in the house I built for both of us. I held it together. I want to be clear about that, because what comes next might make you think I was falling apart. I wasn't. I kept the house maintained, drove myself everywhere, cooked my own meals, managed my finances. My Social Security was $1,450 a month. The house was paid off. I had no debt. I was doing fine. But that first winter after Helen, I got hit with pneumonia. Bad enough that I ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks. Gary came to visit. He brought his wife, Diane. Gary's a real estate attorney. He's sharp, good at his job, and he thinks about everything in terms of liability and risk. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the one I built from a solid slab of black walnut, and he laid it all out in the calm, reasonable voice he probably uses with clients. He explained about probate, about what happens when an elderly parent owns property alone and passes without the right documents in place, about how a simple power of attorney would protect the asset, streamline everything, save time and money for the whole family down the road. I was still weak from the hospital. Helen had been gone less than a year. Gary was sitting right there with paperwork already printed and organized in a folder. I signed it. That was my mistake. The kind of mistake that looks like common sense when you make it, and only shows its real shape later. 18 months after I signed that power of attorney, Gary and Diane showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning in November. No call ahead. Gary had his attorney face on, composed, rehearsed, careful. Diane had a folder, same as before. They sat me down in my own living room and told me the situation. The house had been sold. Gary had already found a buyer through a contact at his firm. $310,000, which he said was a strong number for the area. The closing was scheduled for 30 days out. He'd also researched a care facility nearby. Private room, meals, activities, medical staff available. Very well reviewed. $2,800 a month. I did the arithmetic out loud. My Social Security was $1,450. The facility was $2,800. I said, that doesn't add up. Gary explained that the proceeds from the house sale would cover the difference for years, that I'd be well taken care of, that this was the practical, responsible solution. I looked at him for a moment, then looked at Diane, then asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Did you already sign the sale paperwork?" Gary nodded. "Using my POA." He nodded again and looked at the table. Diane leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice that was very even and very final, "Arnold, you've become a liability. We have our own family, our own future to think about. We can't keep managing this." Liability. That was the word she chose. I sat with that word for a moment. Then I stood up, thanked them for coming, and told them I'd be out by the 15th. They didn't offer to help me pack. They didn't stay. The door closed behind them, and I stood at the window and watched Gary's car pull out of the driveway of the house I built, taking the road I'd graded myself 30 years ago. I had $43 in my wallet. My toolbox was in the garage. Everything else I owned that mattered fit in a duffel bag. I had 2 weeks. I spent the night of November 15th in my truck in a parking lot off Route 15. I had my duffel bag, my toolbox, and a thermos of coffee I'd made that morning in a kitchen that no longer belonged to me. I didn't sleep much. I sat there in the dark and went through the whole thing in my head. Helen, Gary, the POA, the walnut table I'd left behind because I couldn't fit it in a duffel bag. And by the time the sky started going gray, I had worked through most of it. I'm not a man who sits with feelings for long. Never have been. You feel it, you look at it straight, and then you figure out what comes next. That's how I was raised, and that's how I ran a job site for 35 years. Feelings don't frame a wall. You do. So in the morning, I drove to the county administration building to handle some paperwork. Address change, benefits forwarding, the miserable bureaucratic checklist of a man whose life just got reorganized without his input. I took a number and sat down in a plastic chair in the waiting area. That's when I noticed the flyer. It was folded under the leg of the chair next to mine, like someone had dropped it without noticing. County notice. Public auction of condemned and abandoned properties. That afternoon, 2 p.m., downstairs in conference room B. Minimum bid, $1. I read it twice. Then I checked my wallet. $43. Then I looked at the clock on the wall. I had 4 hours. I kept the flyer. Conference room B was a low-ceilinged basement room with folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and the smell of old carpet. By the time I got there with my duffel bag and toolbox, about 30 investors had already filled most of the seats. These were not casual buyers. These were men in clean boots and collared shirts who did this regularly, who talked in shorthand about cap rates and carrying costs and which neighborhoods were moving. I was the only person in the room with a duffel bag on the floor next to my chair. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Carl Pierce. He moved through the early properties fast and with minimal ceremony. A commercial lot in downtown went for $44,000 after a quick bidding war. A house with foundation issues sold for $28,000. A vacant lot near the highway brought $19,000. These men knew what they were doing, and they weren't wasting time. I watched, and I learned. When Carl announced a property, he'd describe it, location, size, known issues, and then open at $1. The investors would run it up from there based on whatever they'd already researched beforehand. If nobody wanted it, it sat. Simple enough. After about 90 minutes, Carl shuffled his papers and got to property number 22. His tone shifted slightly, not unprofessional, but you could hear the difference. "All right, folks, this one's a little special." A few chuckles from the front rows. He read from the sheet. Single-family structure, rural Perry County, approximately 14 miles outside the city. Built circa 1889. Abandoned for approximately 20 years. No electricity, no running water, no functioning septic. Roof damage, broken windows, foundation settling, and He paused for effect. Extensive structural deterioration throughout. County inspector had condemned the property and recommended demolition. The access road was unpaved and potentially impassable in winter months. He looked up from the sheet. Starting bid is $1. Who wants to own a piece of Pennsylvania history? The room laughed. Nobody raised a hand. Carl tried again. Come on, $1. Somebody's got $1. Still nothing. He shrugged and reached for his gavel. $5. My voice came out steady, which surprised me a little. Every head in the room turned. Carl squinted toward the back. Sir, did you bid $5? I did. He set the gavel down. Looked at me for a moment. Duffel bag, toolbox. Clearly not a real estate investor. He was decent enough to give me the full warning. Sir, I want to make sure you understand what you're bidding on. This structure is condemned. It has no utilities. The access road may be snowed in within weeks. The inspector's report recommends demolition, not renovation. I understand. Are you certain you want to proceed? $5 is my bid. Carl looked around the room one more time. Anyone want to bid $6? He said it almost apologetically. Nobody moved. One man near the front was grinning at the guy next to him, shaking his head slowly like he was watching something happen at a carnival. Going once at $5, going twice. He paused. Sold, gentleman in the back. The room didn't applaud exactly. It was more like the particular noise a crowd makes when something both funny and slightly sad has just occurred. I picked up my duffel bag, walked to the front, and put 5 $1 bills on the table. As Carl filled out the transfer paperwork, the man who'd been grinning walked past me toward the exit. He said it without breaking stride. Old man just bought himself a coffin. Maybe, but it had my name on the deed. And I'd learned a long time ago that the only thing that matters about a structure isn't what it looks like on the outside. It's whether the bones are good. My neighbor Ted Norris drove me out there that evening. Ted's a retired welder, owns a few small rental properties in the county, and has the particular quality of a man who will help you do something without requiring a full explanation of why you're doing it. I told him I'd bought a property at auction and needed a ride. He said he'd bring his truck. We didn't talk much on the drive. The roads got progressively rougher, paved to chip seal, to gravel, to 2 dirt tracks through trees, until we came out into a small clearing, and Ted put his headlights on it. I won't pretend it looked good. The structure was maybe 900 square feet, timber frame, sitting on a stone foundation that had settled unevenly on one corner. The roof sagged in the middle and had a gap on the east side you could see sky through. Every window was gone, just empty frames with glass teeth at the edges. The front porch had collapsed on one end. Vines had worked their way into the wall on the north side. The whole building leaned a few degrees to the left, like a man favoring a bad knee. Ted let out a long breath and said nothing. I got out of the truck and walked up to it. I put my hand on the front door frame. Solid oak, hand-hewn, tight mortise and tenon, even after 130 years. I knocked on the exterior wall. Dense. No hollow sound, no give. Old-growth timber. I'd been building and repairing structures my whole adult life, and I knew what I was hearing. Under everything the weather and the years had done to this place, the bones were good. I turned back to Ted. I'll need that tarp you've got in the truck bed. He looked at the building, then at me, then back at the building. Arnold, you sure about this? I'm sure about the framing, I said. That's enough for tonight. We spent the next hour securing the tarp over the roof gap with rope and whatever exposed beams I could reach from a ladder. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep direct rain off the worst section. Ted left me the battery lantern from his glove box, a wool blanket he'd had in the cab, and a thermos of water. Before he drove away, he said, I'll come back in a few days. I said I'd appreciate that. Then he was gone, and it was just me and the trees and the sound of wind moving through the pines. I went inside, cleared a section of floor with a branch I'd dragged in, laid out the blanket, and sat down with my back against the wall. The lantern put out a warm circle of light, Outside, the temperature was dropping toward freezing. My breath was already showing. I looked around at what I'd bought for $5. Dirt floor. No, wait. I looked closer. Under the debris and the years of leaves, there were floorboards. Wide ones, maybe 10 inches. Probably white oak. I scraped at the corner of one with my boot heel. Solid. Not punky, not soft. Good bones. I turned off the lantern to save the battery, pulled the blanket up, and went to sleep. The first week was about survival. Not in a dramatic sense. I wasn't lost in the wilderness. I was 14 miles from a hardware store. But without heat, without running water, and with nighttime temps dropping into the low 20s, the margin for error was thin enough that I had to think clearly about every decision. Water, first. I found a creek about 150 yards downhill from the house, running fast over rocks. Clean enough to work with once I had purification tablets, which Ted brought on his second visit along with a camp stove, 2 propane canisters, and a box of oatmeal. He set them on my makeshift workbench, a plank across 2 sawhorses, and looked around at what I'd managed to do in 4 days. I'd cleared the main room completely, swept every decade of leaves and debris out the front door, pulled the worst of the broken glass from the window frames, and gotten a rough sense of what I was working with structurally. The answer was, better than it looked from outside, worse than I'd hoped in a few specific spots. Ted said, "You've done more in 4 days than most guys would do in a month." I said the alternative was freezing, so he laughed. Then he got serious and told me people in town were talking. That word had gotten around about the old man who bought the condemned property for $5. Some people thought it was sad. Some thought it was crazy. Nobody thought it was going to work. I told him I appreciated the update and asked if he could bring a come-along hoist next time. I had a section of ridge beam that needed persuading. That's how the first month went. Ted brought tools and supplies every few days. Howard Briggs, who owns the hardware store off Route 34, gave me part-time work. Inventory, deliveries, repairs, at $20 an hour cash. 3 days a week, I drove Howard's spare truck into town at 6 a.m. and worked until noon. The other days I was at the property from first light until I couldn't see anymore. The sequence was roof, then windows, then floor. You always work top to bottom. Every carpenter knows that. I patched the roof gap with salvaged tin roofing I found collapsed in the back shed, sistered the damaged rafters with new lumber, and got it weather-tight before the first hard snow hit in early December. The windows I framed with rough-cut pine and fitted with plastic sheeting as a temporary measure. Not pretty, but it cut the wind completely. The interior temperature jumped 15 degrees overnight. I found an old cast-iron wood stove in the back room, buried under debris. The firebox was sound. The flue pipe was rusted through in 2 sections, but replaceable. I cleaned it out, ran new pipe, and had heat by the 2nd week of December. Real heat, the kind that gets into the walls and stays. By then I'd also started sleeping on an actual cot. Ted had produced one from somewhere, and eating real meals on the camp stove. Rice, canned beans, eggs when I drove into town. I was stiff in the mornings, and my back let me know about every hour of the workday. But I was getting stronger, not weaker. Muscle memory is a real thing. My hands had not forgotten anything, and that's when I found it. It was a Thursday in mid-December. I was replacing a cluster of floorboards in the main room's east corner. 6 boards that had gone soft all the way through, too far gone to sister over. I pulled them up one by one and stacked them by the door. When I pulled the last one, I didn't find a dirt subfloor underneath. I found a wooden hatch, roughly 2 feet square, fitted flush into the framing, with a small iron ring set into the face. Whoever built it had done clean work. The edges were tight, the ring was centered. This wasn't accidental. Someone had built this on purpose, and built it to last. I stared at it for a moment. Then I grabbed the ring and pulled. The hatch swung up on leather hinges, stiff but intact. Below was a stone-lined space, maybe 4 feet deep, cool and dry the way only below-grade stone stays dry in Pennsylvania winters. Built into the side wall was a simple wooden shelf. On the shelf sat a flat wooden case, maybe 3 feet across, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had gone brittle but had done its job. I climbed down, lifted it out, and set it on my workbench. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, rolled architectural drawings, maybe 30 of them, on heavy drafting paper that had stayed dry and flat for over a century. Underneath the drawings, a leather-bound journal, the cover dried and cracked, but the binding still tight. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was careful and small, European-trained, the kind of penmanship you don't see anymore. At the top of the page, in faded brown ink, F. Bauer, Private Record of Works and Observations, Pennsylvania, 1887 to 1891. I set the journal down on the workbench. I stood there in my cold, half-repaired house with sawdust on my boots and looked at that name for a long time. Friedrich Bauer. I knew that name. Every contractor who'd worked in central Pennsylvania long enough knew that name. Bauer was one of the serious ones, a German immigrant who came over in the 1880s and designed courthouses, mill buildings, estate homes across the state before dying in 1892. His original drawings had been considered lost since his death. Architecture historians had spent decades trying to reconstruct his methods from photographs and second-hand descriptions. I was holding his complete archive in a $5 house, in a hatch under the floor. I wrapped everything back exactly as I'd found it, replaced the oilcloth, closed the case, and set it carefully in the corner. Then I sat on the edge of my cot and thought about it for a good long while. Then I went back to work on the floor. Some things you need to sit with before you know what to do with them. But this much I already understood. Whatever I'd bought for $5, it was not nothing. I told Ted about the hatch the next time he came by. I showed him the case, unrolled 2 of the drawings on my workbench, and let him look. Ted's not an architect or a historian, but he's a smart man who reads widely, and when he saw the name on the journal cover, he went quiet in the way people go quiet when something lands harder than they expected. He said he knew someone at the University of Pittsburgh, a professor in the history department who specialized in 19th century Pennsylvania architecture. He asked if I'd let him reach out. I said yes, but on one condition. Nobody takes anything off this property without my say-so. Ted said that was more than fair. Dr. Margaret Lawson drove out 10 days later in a university fleet car. She was in her early 50s, professional, and I could tell from the way she looked at the property coming up the drive that she was prepared to be polite about a dead end. She'd been called about promising fines before, I imagined, and most of them weren't. That lasted until she opened the case. She put on cotton gloves she'd brought in her bag and went through the drawings one by one. Slowly, cross-referencing entries in the journal against a reference book she'd brought along. After about 45 minutes, she looked up at me with an expression I recognized. It's the same look a man gets when he pulls back old paneling and finds original old-growth timber underneath. The look of something exceeding what you thought you were going to find. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "do you have any idea how long people have been looking for these?" "I've got a general idea," I said. She explained it properly. Bauer had designed over 40 significant structures across central Pennsylvania between 1887 and his death in 1892. Courthouses, mill buildings, private estates. His working drawings, the originals with his notations and measurements, had never been found after he died. Architectural historians had spent decades reconstructing his methods from photographs and written descriptions. What I had in that case was his complete private archive. Every project, every notation, in his own hand. The State Historical Society got involved within the month. The authentication process took 6 weeks. In April, About 5 months after I'd first pulled up that floorboard, the property was officially designated a Pennsylvania historical site. With that designation came a preservation grant of $85,000. Enough to restore the structure properly, install plumbing and electricity, and build a small climate-controlled room for the Bauer collection. I stayed on as the site caretaker. The university set up a research partnership. Scholars started coming out regularly to study the drawings. I learned enough about Bauer's methods over those months that I could answer most of their questions, which I'll admit I found satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Turns out 35 years of carpentry gives you a decent foundation for understanding how a serious architect thinks about structure. Between the caretaker stipend, my hours at Howard's store, and Social Security, I was more comfortable than I'd been in years. And then it was Thanksgiving. I was splitting wood in the side yard when Gary's car came up the drive. I set the maul down and waited. He looked different than he had in November, less certain of himself. Diane was with him, and she looked the same as always, composed, prepared, with an agenda already organized in her head. She did most of the talking. She'd seen the coverage in the local paper and had done her research. She understood the property had significant value now. Historical designation, ongoing university partnership, state involvement. She thought perhaps it made more sense for it to be in the hands of an institution that could manage it properly. The university would compensate me fairly. I could live somewhere more appropriate. We were family, after all. I let her finish. Then I looked at Gary. He met my eyes for about 2 seconds, then looked at the ground. That told me everything I needed to know about whose idea this visit was. I said, "Gary, you see this house?" He looked up. I reframed the roof. I replaced the floor joists. I repointed the foundation by hand, one section at a time. I found what was hidden in it because I was willing to get on my knees and do the work. I picked up the maul. You used my signature to sell the house I built. You called me a liability and left me with $43. Now you're standing on my property telling me what makes sense. I set a log on the block and split it clean. You made your choice. I made mine. Get off my land. Diane started to say something. Gary put his hand on her arm. They walked back to the car and drove away without another word. I split the rest of the pile. Then I went inside and made coffee. My 69th birthday was last spring. Ted came, and Howard, and Dr. Lawson, and about a dozen researchers and neighbors who'd become regular fixtures in my life over the past 2 years. We had a cookout in the yard next to the house. Dr. Lawson brought a copy of an academic paper she'd published, The Dawson Discovery, the Recovered Bauer Archive, and its implications for Pennsylvania architectural history. My name was on it, not as a footnote, as co-discoverer. I read my name on that paper and held it for a minute. Later, after everyone had gone, I went into the main room and stood by the east wall where the hatch is. It's covered with a proper access panel now, hinged and latched, the Bauer collection stored in the climate-controlled room next door. I stood there and thought about the Thursday in December when I pulled up that last floorboard with no idea what was underneath it. Here's what I know now at 67, going on 70. Standing in a house I fixed with my own hands that everyone else had written off. A man's worth isn't what his family says it is. It's not what the county inspector puts in a report. It's not the sound of 30 investors laughing at him in a basement room. It's what he builds, what he fixes, what he refuses to walk away from when everyone else already has. I came out here with $43, a toolbox, and nowhere to sleep. I found something that had been hidden for 130 years, waiting under a floor for someone to pull up the right board. Sometimes the thing everybody else throws away is exactly the thing you were always supposed to find. The $5 house turned out to be worth more than anything I ever built for somebody else. Not because of the grant money or the research papers or the historical marker out front. Because I earned it. Every cold morning, every aching hour, every board and joist and stone. It's mine. And nobody is taking it from me again.